The iron muzzle was rusted shut with dried blood. They called him a monster, a pit fighter meant for the slaughter. I only wanted a laborer to save my dying estate. But the moment I handed over my last silver coin, I didn't realize I had just bought the Alpha King. The mud-washed markets of Ethelgard reeked of wet wool livestock and desperation. It was the year of a brutal famine, and the cold winds biting through my threadbare cloak were a harsh reminder that winter was only weeks away. My name is Catherine Rothesay. A year ago, I was the daughter of a respected lord. Today I was an orphan, standing on the brink of ruin, clutching a small leather pouch that contained the very last of my family's wealth. Lord Ewan Rothesay. My father had died, leaving a mountain of debt to the local magistrate Lord Reginald Danvers. Reginald was a cruel, bloated man who possessed a notorious appetite for expanding his lands and a terrifying obsession with breaking the spirits of those beneath him. He had given me a harsh ultimatum: repair the estate's collapsed grain mill and pay the winter tithe by the first snowfall or forfeit Rothesay Manor entirely. The mill required the strength of 3 men to rebuild. I had only the coin to hire 1 cheap hand. That was what brought me to the slave blocks, a shameful, wretched place I had sworn never to visit. Master Godwin, a slaver with rotting teeth and a voice like grating iron, paraded his miserable captives onto the wooden stage. Most were sickly, starving peasants, imprisoned for petty theft. They wouldn't last a week hauling timber. I was about to turn away, defeated, when Godwin cracked a heavy spiked bullwhip against the wooden floorboards. And now for the main spectacle. Godwin roared, his eyes gleaming with greedy delight. A creature caught in the deepest ravines of the Oakhaven woods. It took 20 of my best hunters to bring him down, and half of them won't ever walk again. The crowd murmured, pressing closer. From the shadows of a reinforced iron cage, 4 heavily armored guards dragged out a man, or rather a beast shaped like a man. He was colossal, towering over his captors, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His skin was tanned and layered with fresh whip marks and silver-lined scars that looked strangely deliberate. But it was his face that silenced the bustling square. His head was encased in a heavy rusted iron muzzle. Thick leather straps wrapped around his neck padlocked tight, preventing him from opening his jaw more than an inch. His thick dark hair fell over his face, but beneath the grime and the iron bars of his cage, his eyes locked onto the crowd. They were not the eyes of a broken slave. They were a brilliant, terrifying amber, and they burned with a simmering, predatory rage. "He does not speak!" Godwin shouted to the terrified onlookers. "He does not yield. He is fit only for the fighting pits, who will start the bidding at 10 silvers. 15! A voice boomed from the back. The crowd parted, bowing their heads as Lord Reginald Danvers stepped forward, flanked by his armed guards. He sneered at the muzzled man. "I have a new pair of fighting bears at my estate. This savage will provide excellent entertainment for my guests on Saturday." The muzzled man didn't flinch, but a low, vibrating sound emanated from his chest, a rumbling growl so deep I felt it in the soles of my boots. I looked at the man. His raw power was undeniable. If anyone could lift the massive oak beams of my ruined mill, it was him. But it was more than just cold calculation that stirred within me. When his amber eyes swept over the crowd, they briefly locked onto mine. In that fraction of a second, the breath was knocked from my lungs. I felt a strange, invisible pull, a spark of electricity that made my pulse roar in my ears. He wasn't just an animal. There was a profound, tortured intelligence behind that iron mask. 20 silvers. I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to carry. The crowd gasped. Reginald whipped his head around his eyes, narrowing as he recognized me. Lady Catherine, he mocked, emphasizing the title. Playing with coins you do not have. Go home before you embarrass your father's ghost. 25. Reginald barked at Godwin. My hands shook as I reached into my cloak. I pulled out a heavy gold chain bearing a large teardrop sapphire, my mother's wedding pendant. It was my only remaining anchor to the past. "The pendant!" I yelled, holding it up so the afternoon sun caught the jewel. "It is worth at least 50 silvers, Godwin. I bid the pendant." Godwin's eyes nearly bulged out of his skull. Reginald's face flushed purple with outrage. "You stupid girl!" Reginald hissed, stepping toward me. "You would throw away your mother's legacy on a feral pit dog." "The bid is 50 silvers," I replied, forcing my chin up. "Unless you wish to match it?" "My lord," Reginald scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Keep the monster. He'll likely tear your throat out in your sleep. It will save me the trouble of evicting you." Godwin snatched the sapphire from my hand with terrifying speed. "Sold to the Lady Rothesay." The guards aggressively shoved the muzzled man toward me. He stumbled, his massive frame dwarfing my own. Up close, he smelled of rain pine and copper blood. He looked down at me, the iron bars of his muzzle casting dark shadows over his face. I had just traded my past for a dangerous, unknown future. The journey back to Rothesay Manor took hours, the wooden cart rattling violently over the rutted dirt roads. Rain began to pour, a freezing, relentless deluge. I sat at the front, holding the reins of my tired draft horse, while the man I had bought sat in the back. I had asked Godwin for his name, but the slaver only laughed, tossing me a heavy iron key. "He ain't got a name, lady. Just a warning. You unlock that jaw, you sign your own death warrant." When we finally reached the estate, the sun had vanished behind heavy storm clouds. The manor stood dark and hollow against the skyline, its grand stone walls now covered in creeping ivy and moss. I led the man out of the cart and into the old stone barn. It was draughty but dry, filled with the scent of old hay and damp wood. I lit a single oil lantern and hung it on a nail. The flickering orange light illuminated him. He stood perfectly still in the center of the barn water, dripping from his broad shoulders. He was shivering, though he tried to hide it. His wrists were bound in heavy iron cuffs, and the rusted muzzle looked agonizing, cutting into his cheekbones. "Sit," I commanded softly. He didn't move. He just stared at me with those piercing amber eyes. "Please." I tried again, my voice wavering slightly. "You're injured. You need to sit." Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive frame onto a bale of hay. I approached him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I pulled the heavy iron key from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I remembered Godwin's warning. You sign your own death warrant. But looking at the deep, infected wounds around the leather straps of the muzzle, I knew I couldn't leave him like this. He wasn't a dog. I stepped into his personal space. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He flinched slightly as my cold fingers brushed the skin of his neck to find the padlock. I slipped the key in. With a loud metallic clack, the lock sprang open. I unbuckled the leather straps. The heavy iron cage fell from his face, clattering loudly against the stone floor. I stumbled backward, half expecting him to lunge at me. Instead, he reached up, rubbing his raw jawline. He took a deep, ragged breath, flexing his mouth for the first time in what must have been months. His face was striking sharp, aristocratic cheekbones beneath a layer of dirt, a strong jaw and lips that were presently drawn into a tight line of pain. He looked at me, his amber eyes pinning me to the spot. "You shouldn't have done that, little bird," he rasped. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough from disuse, but carrying an undeniable accent of high-born authority. I swallowed hard. "You can speak." "I can do many things," he replied, his gaze dropping to my throat for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "Why did you buy me?" "I need a laborer," I answered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "My mill is collapsed. I need it rebuilt before the snow falls, or I lose this land. In exchange for your work, I offer you shelter food and I won't treat you like an animal." He let out a short, dark chuckle. "I am an animal, Lady Rothesay." "How do you know my name?" I asked, startled. "The wind carries many secrets," he murmured cryptically. "My name is Grayson." For the next 2 weeks, Grayson proved to be a force of nature. He didn't just work. He conquered the labor. Planks of solid oak that would normally require 3 men to lift Grayson hoisted onto his shoulders with a terrifying, effortless grace. He worked shirtless in the freezing autumn air, sweat gleaming over his heavily scarred back. I watched him from the manor window more often than I cared to admit. There was a raw, magnetic masculinity to him that left me flushed and confused. But there were strange things, too. The deep whip gashes on his back that Godwin had inflicted healed in a matter of days, leaving barely a pink trace. My hunting hounds, usually fiercely protective, would whimper and hide under the porch whenever Grayson walked past, and at night, when the moon was high, he would vanish from the barn. I would hear the distant, haunting howls of wolves in the Oakhaven woods, and the next morning, Grayson would return smelling of pine needles and fresh blood, his eyes glowing slightly in the dawn light. I asked no questions. The mill was nearly finished, and I was beginning to feel a flicker of hope, until the evening Lord Reginald's men came. I was in the courtyard inspecting a sack of grain when 4 armed riders smashed through the rotting wooden gates of the estate. Leading them was Captain Hayes, Reginald's chief enforcer, a vile man with a scarred lip and a reputation for brutality. "Lady Catherine," Hayes shouted, dismounting his horse heavily. "Lord Danvers sends his regards. He has decided he does not want to wait for the first snow. He wants the deed to Rothesay Manor tonight." "He cannot do that," I yelled, stepping back as Hayes and his men advanced, drawing their steel swords. "The agreement was set before the magistrate. The magistrate is currently enjoying Lord Danvers' wine." Hayes sneered, grabbing me by the arm and throwing me violently to the mud. I gasped as pain shot through my shoulder. "Hand over the deed, girl, or we will take it from your corpse and burn this miserable house to the ground." One of the men grabbed my hair, pulling me up, while Hayes raised his armored hand to strike me. Suddenly, a terrifying roar shattered the evening air. It wasn't the shout of a man. It sounded like the furious bellow of a prehistoric beast. Before Hayes could swing, a massive blur of shadow and muscle collided with him. Hayes was thrown through the air, crashing through the wooden fence 10 feet away. The other 3 men scrambled, raising their swords in panic. Grayson stood between them and me. But he looked different. His muscles bulged unnaturally, straining against his tunic. His fingernails had extended into thick black talons. The bones in his face seemed to be shifting, elongating, and his teeth were sharp, glinting in the moonlight. "Get away from her!" Grayson snarled, his voice distorted, layered with a demonic dual octave. "Kill the slave!" One of the enforcers screamed, lunging with his long sword. Grayson didn't even dodge. He caught the steel blade with his bare hand. The sharp metal cut deep into his palm, but he didn't flinch. With a sickening crunch, Grayson twisted his wrist, shattering the steel blade into pieces. Then he grabbed the man by the throat and hurled him effortlessly into the stone wall of the manor. The man slumped to the ground unconscious. The remaining 2 men dropped their weapons, their faces pale with absolute terror. They looked past Grayson toward the tree line of the Oakhaven woods. I followed their gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. Emerging from the shadows of the forest were wolves. But they were not normal wolves. They were the size of small horses, their fur thick and black as pitch, their eyes glowing with lethal intent. There were dozens of them silently stepping into the courtyard surrounding the remaining men. The largest of the wolves, a terrifying beast with silver fur streaked across its snout, stepped forward. But it didn't attack. Instead, the giant wolf lowered its massive head, dropping to its belly in a deep, submissive bow. It was bowing to Grayson. Grayson slowly turned to look at me, his amber eyes burning with an ancient, untamed fire. The blood from his sliced palm was already smoking the skin, knitting back together right before my eyes. "I told you, little bird," Grayson whispered, the sound carrying over the terrified whimpers of the dying men. "I am an animal." He wasn't just a werewolf. He was their king. And I had just put a leash on him. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. The two remaining enforcers, realizing their swords were utterly useless against a horde of giant, dire wolves, dropped to their knees in the mud, weeping and begging for their miserable lives. Grayson did not even look at them. He gestured sharply with his chin toward the tree line. The giant, silver-snouted wolf rose from its bough, let out a low, rumbling bark, and the pack surged forward. They did not kill the men. They simply chased them, their terrifying snarls echoing as they drove Reginald's cowards far off the Rothsay lands. When the courtyard was empty, save for the unconscious man against the wall, Grayson turned his attention back to me. I was backed against the wooden cart, my heart threatening to crack my ribs. He stepped closer, his form shifting back to that of a man, though the raw, predatory energy remained thick in the air. "Do not look at me with that fear, O Catherine," he said softly, using my given name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. You are a werewolf," I stammered, clutching my injured shoulder. "A king. I was a king," he corrected, his amber eyes darkening with a sorrow so deep it seemed to consume the light. He reached out. I flinched, but his large, calloused hand gently bypassed my face and rested over my torn shoulder. A sudden intense heat radiated from his palm. I gasped as the sharp, throbbing pain of my injury vanished, replaced by a soothing warmth. When he pulled his hand away, the skin was completely unblemished. "How did you end up in a slaver's iron cage?" I asked, my fear slowly giving way to an overwhelming curiosity. A creature of his power should never have been captured by mere men. Grayson's jaw clenched. "I was not captured in battle, Catherine. I was sold by my own blood." He looked out toward the dark horizon. "My half-brother Calvin. We shared a father, but not a mother. Calvin always coveted the Alpha's mantle. 2 months ago, during the autumn equinox feast, he laced my ceremonial wine with liquid silver and the ash of the monk's hood flower, a lethal poison to my kind. It paralyzed my beast, stripped me of my strength, and bound my shifting abilities." He looked back at me, the memory of the betrayal burning in his eyes. "Calvin could not kill me outright without inciting a civil war among the packs, so he humiliated me. He chained me in iron, locked a muzzle over my face to prevent me from ordering my loyalists, and sold me to Godwin's flesh merchants. He assumed I would die fighting in the human pits, forgotten and nameless. But the poison wore off," I whispered, putting the pieces together. "Slowly. Over weeks of starvation and beatings," Grayson replied. "But even as my strength returned, the rusted iron muzzle was laced with silver runes. It kept my wolf suppressed. I was trapped in my own mind, waiting for a chance to break free." He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over me. And then a human girl with fire in her eyes traded her mother's sapphire to buy my life. I only needed a laborer. I deflected my cheeks, burning under his intense gaze. You showed me mercy when the world had shown me nothing but the whip. Grayson countered his voice, dropping to a gravelly purr. He leaned in, taking a deep breath of the air near my neck. And then there is the scent. I noticed it the moment you unlocked my cage. Do you know why my wolves bowed to me, but did not touch you? I shook my head, mesmerized by the golden flecks in his eyes. Because they smell it too, he whispered, his thumb brushing against my cheekbone. Werewolves do not serve humans, Catherine, but an alpha will burn the world to ash for his fated mate. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. Mate. The word carried an ancient, unbreakable weight, but before I could process the terrifying, exhilarating reality that the Alpha King had just laid claim to my soul, a jagged howl ripped through the night air. It was not a howl of loyalty. It was a chaotic, bloodthirsty screech. Grayson's romantic demeanor vanished instantly. His eyes snapped toward the eastern road leading to town. They are here! He snarled, his fangs elongating once more. Who? I asked, panic rising again. Calvin Orga, Grayson said, stepping in front of me to shield my body. And he has brought an army. The twist of fate was a cruel one. Lord Reginald had not retreated in defeat. When his surviving men returned with tales of giant wolves and a man with glowing eyes, Reginald had immediately sent word to the neighboring territories. But he hadn't just summoned human mercenaries. Reginald had made a secret pact with the usurper. Calvin had promised Reginald the Rothsay lands, not for farming, but because, beneath my family's estate, lay the ancient Moonstone Caverns, a sacred site of power that Calvin needed to officially anoint himself as the undisputed king of the wolves. My father's debt, the sabotage of the mill, the impossible winter tithe, it had all been a calculated conspiracy to force me off the land, so Reginald could hand it to Calvin. Through the pouring rain, a massive procession of torches crested the hill. There were over 100 men, heavily armed, alongside dozens of massive mangy wolves that reeked of rot and dark magic rogues, loyal only to Calvin. At the front of the army rode Lord Reginald on a black war horse, and beside him stood a man who looked like a twisted, cruel mirror of Grayson. Calvin. Brother. Calvin's voice echoed across the valley, dripping with venomous glee. I heard a rumor that a stray dog was squatting on my new property. I see you found someone to take your leash. Grayson's chest rumbled with a thunderous growl. Go inside the manor, Catherine. Lock the iron doors. I am not leaving you, I said fiercely, grabbing a heavy iron pitchfork from the barn wall. This is my home. Grayson looked at me, a fierce, proud smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Then stand behind me, my queen. The slaughter begins tonight. The battle erupted with the ferocity of a hurricane. Calvin gave the command, and the rogue wolves charged down the hill, snapping their jaws, while Reginald's archers fired a volley of flaming arrows into the sky. The arrows rained down, striking the thatched roof of the barn and the wooden scaffolding of the newly built mill. Fire illuminated the dark, stormy night, turning the Rothsay courtyard into a hellscape. But Grayson was no longer a muzzled slave. He threw his head back and let out an earth-shattering roar that shook the rainwater from the trees. From the shadows of the Oakhaven woods, Grayson's loyalist pack answered. Over 50 massive, dire wolves burst from the tree line, colliding with Calvin's rogues in a brutal, bloody clash of teeth and claws. The sound of snarling beasts and the clashing of human steel filled the air. Grayson didn't bother fully shifting. He remained in his devastating hybrid form, a towering beast of muscle fur and black talons. He tore through Reginald's mercenaries with terrifying ease, swiping men off their feet, snapping swords in half, and clearing a bloody path straight toward the leaders. I did not hide. I stayed near the stone steps of the manor, using my pitchfork to keep 2 rogue wolves at bay, my adrenaline masking the sheer terror. Reginald, seeing the absolute massacre of his paid men, panicked. He yanked the reins of his horse, trying to flee. But a massive grey wolf leaped onto the horse's flank, dragging the cruel lord to the mud. Reginald screamed as the wolves surrounded him, his ambitions ending in the very dirt he had tried to steal from my family. Calvin, however, didn't run. He drew a massive broadsword, the blade gleaming with pure, deadly silver. "You are weak from the iron, Grayson," Calvin roared, stepping over the bodies of his fallen rogues. "You have no right to the crown. I am the crown," Grayson bellowed, charging his brother. The 2 alphas collided. The impact sounded like 2 boulders smashing together. Calvin swung the silver sword, slicing a deep, smoking gash across Grayson's chest. Grayson roared in pain, the silver burning his flesh and slowing his healing. He retaliated with a brutal backhand that sent Calvin crashing into the wooden pillars of the grain mill. The brothers fought with a savage, unmatched brutality. But Calvin was right. Grayson had spent months starving in an iron cage. His stamina was failing. Calvin managed to kick Grayson in the knees, forcing the true king to the ground, and raised the silver broadsword for a decapitating strike. "Die, brother!" Calvin sneered. "No!" I screamed. Without thinking, I grabbed a discarded flaming torch from the mud. I didn't aim for Calvin. I aimed for the heavy canvas sacks stacked inside the damaged mill, right behind him. The sacks I had been inspecting earlier that evening. Sacks filled with fine, dry grain dust. I threw the torch with all my might. It landed perfectly in the center of the torn sacks. In a confined space, grain dust is as explosive as black powder. A massive concussive boom ripped through the courtyard. A fireball erupted from the mill, blowing the wooden walls outward. Calvin caught in the blast. Radius was thrown violently through the air, dropping his silver sword, his clothes catching fire. Grayson, shielded by his rapid reflexes, shielded his face and rolled away. He instantly sprang to his feet, ignoring his wounds. Before Calvin could recover from the blast, Grayson was on him. He grabbed his traitorous brother by the throat, lifting him entirely off the ground. "Your reign is over, usurper!" Grayson snarled into Calvin's face. With a sickening snap, Grayson broke Calvin's neck. The usurper's body went limp, falling to the muddy ground. Silence fell over the courtyard. The fire crackled in the ruined mill, but the fighting stopped instantly. Calvin's surviving rogues, seeing their leader dead, whined in submission, dropping to their bellies and exposing their throats to Grayson. The human mercenaries had either fled or were dead. Grayson stood victorious amidst the smoke and rain. He was bleeding, covered in ash and mud, but he had never looked more like a king. Slowly the remaining wolves of both packs gathered around him, sitting on their haunches, bowing their heads in absolute reverence. He turned away from them and walked toward me. The fierce, terrifying beast morphed back into the man I had bought in the slave market. He fell to his knees in front of me, wrapping his massive arms around my waist, burying his face in my stomach. He was trembling not from cold or pain, but from the overwhelming rush of the mate bond. "You saved my life," he rasped, looking up at me. "You saved my home," I replied gently, running my fingers through his thick, dark hair. Grayson stood up, taking my dirt-stained hands in his. "Rothesay Manor will never fall, Catherine. Tomorrow my pack will rebuild your mill. We will rebuild your walls. This land will become the new heart of the werewolf kingdom." He kissed my knuckles, his amber eyes burning with absolute devotion. "I once belonged to you as a muzzled slave. Now I offer myself to you as your king. Will you be my Luna?" I looked around at the ruined courtyard, the bowing wolves, and finally at the man who had shattered my ordinary world. I smiled, the rain washing the soot from my face. "Only if you promise never to wear a muzzle again," I whispered. Grayson pulled me into a fierce, passionate kiss, sealing our fate beneath the smoke and the stormy sky. I had bought a monster to save a mill, but in the end I had freed a king to rule my heart. If you were captivated by Catherine and Grayson's story of betrayal, savage loyalty, and forbidden love, do not leave just yet. Hit that like button, share this tale with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling original audio stories. What would you do if you accidentally bought a werewolf king? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you next time.